Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at and that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality and not illusion or delusion that's going to determine what the future will bring. And I have to remind you, the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views. And for the next hour, they're going to be the views of our good friend Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. And we're going to be talking about what's really going on behind the scenes. You have to understand the media is tightly controlled, and most people are not getting proper information either from the conservative leaders or the liberal leaders or the religious leaders, and certainly not from the media. Joel, thanks very much for being with us.
My pleasure, Dr. Stan. This time of year, the last issue of the World Affairs Brief, I give a big picture briefing. So today we're going to talk about the American empire and its enemies. As I say, we need to always step back sometimes from the specific stories and take an overview of our rapidly declining state of American liberty and how the establishment's mobilizing mainstream media support and forces to thwart the growing resistance movement that we're trying to build and the state of the world's most dangerous hotspots. Well, this week, or the week before, George Freeman of Stratfor.com came out with a major propaganda piece on behalf of government called The Unintended Empire. Have you seen that, Dr. Stan?
No, I really haven't, but of course it's not unintended. This whole thing has been carefully planned for a long time, but go ahead.
That's right. America's transformation from protector of American liberties to intervenor around the world in the name of globalism, that's the empire we're talking about, was never anything but unintended, as Friedman claims. Friedman starts off with his description of the American empire and fails to even decry what he describes, which is truly horrendous. Quote, the American president is still the most important political leader in the world. The reason is simple. He governs a nation whose economic and military policies shape the lives of people in every country on every continent. The president can and does order invasions, embargoes, and sanctions. The economic policies he shapes will resonate in billions of lives, perhaps over many generations. Resonate? What an evil euphemism. How about destroy the lives of many people, perhaps over the continent? This is typical of George Friedman, and I'll describe a little bit more about his background as we go through this. But here's William N. Griggs' articulate response as he decries America's claim to be exempt from the moral laws of the nation. Quote, if we have to use force, it is because we are America. We are the indispensable nation. We stand tall. We see further into the future. He says this panegyric is what is commonly called American exceptionalism, and it could have been composed by any number of GOP-aligned media figures on Fox News, such as Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Mark Levin, and other legions of local imitators. The words were actually spoken by Madeleine Albright in 1998 when she was in the Clinton administration's Secretary of State. She was defending the U.S. role in enforcing an embargo on Iraq in the aftermath of the first Gulf War, which killed more children than in Hiroshima. CBS commentator Leslie Stahl challenged Albright with those statistics about the numbers of deaths. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima, she said. Or he said, and you know, is the price worth it? Albright coldly replied, we think the price is worth it.
And the price, the number was 500,000 children. 500,000 children. This is interesting. Apparently he didn't give that figure, did he?
No, he didn't.
No, and
I'll put that in the brief, because that's a good figure, Stan.
Yeah, ladies and gentlemen, you must understand that we're killing children throughout the world. And men and women become accomplices to the evils they fail to oppose. The American people are good people. My country, America, is a great country. It's just been taken over by a group of very evil people who control the media and control our reality. Well, this is Dr. Stan here. It's a Thursday, and of course our guest for this hour is Joel Skousen of World Affairs Brief. And Joel is simply summarizing this last year and what is going on. He's starting off with an article in Stratfor. Now, Stratfor is a propaganda arm of the establishment here, and there's an article written about America's unintended empire, and the author of this article is saying we really didn't intend to create an empire. It just sort of happened, and nothing could be further from the truth. A group of people took over control of our government so they could use the military and financial power of the United States to bring about a one-world dictatorship, to lower the standard of the American people, to raise living standards throughout the world, to place in power ruthless tyrants all throughout the world who would crush opposition and, of course, if independent. So the world leaders don't want to go along with our agenda, why we have them killed. We have certainly our troops stationed in 130 nations throughout the world. We have 800 to 900 military bases throughout the world. Why do we have that? Because the real foreign policy of America is to maintain the empire as a stepping stone to the one world government, the one world godless dictatorship. I shouldn't say it's godless. There will be a God, it just will not be the Christian God. There's an active program of destroying Christianity being coordinated at the highest levels of our government. And that's why they took God and prayer and the Ten Commandments out of our schools. Joel Skousen, pick up the story.
Well, it would be hypocritical. Nothing bothers me more, Stan, when these people pray and these people, call upon the name of God to God bless America and their globalist agenda. I'd rather they not speak of God, frankly. God doesn't, it's blasphemy, frankly. Anyway, Friedman's proposed a more benevolent-sounding excuse for the American empire by force. He says, as befits the global empire, the United States aligns its economic system and its military system to stand as the guarantor of the global economy. Well, that's not really true. More so as it's the guarantee of globalist control through economic and military intervention. He says the United States simultaneously provides technologies and others goods and services to buy, and an enormous market in which to sell, and armed forces to keep the sea lanes open. Well, even that's only true selectively. Judging by the rampant piracy in the sea lanes of Africa, or China pushing around smaller nations with her navy, the U.S. does little to intervene unless there's a larger political agenda. He says, if need be, it moves in to police unruly areas, but it does this not to the benefit of the countries, but for itself.
Hold that thought. Hold that thought. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Chris Joel is pointing out that, Chris, so we're trying to convince the American people everything we're doing is for the people. We just want to bring peace to the world. We want to protect the women and the children. And we hear this theme over and over again as we're slaughtering women and children throughout the world. People do not understand, and you can check this on the Internet if you have any question, that we actually killed approximately 500,000 Iraqi children during the embargo between 1991 and the year 2003, and since then we've probably killed another 1 million people, predominantly women and children, in Iraq. Now, if you want to check that out, just put on your search engine Madeleine Albright 500,000 children in Iraq, and you can pull down the story of when Madeleine Albright was asked about the 500,000 children who died because of the embargo American put on to Iraq over a period of 12 years, and that was an embargo on medicines, all the things that you need for the health of children, and 500,000 of them, it said, have died. And when Madeleine Albright was asked what she thought of that, her remark, whether it was worth it, she said, yes, certainly it was worth it. Ladies and gentlemen, we are responsible for what our government does. You say, well, I don't believe it. Well, you haven't then proved me wrong. Find out if these things could really be true. And then remember that men and women do become accomplices to the evils, not that they perform, but they fail to oppose. And what are you doing about it? Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, Friedman says ultimately the power of the American economy and the distribution of American military force makes alignment with the U.S. a necessity for many countries. It is this necessity that binds countries to the United States more tightly than any formal imperial system could hope to accomplish. Well, that's what these globalist interventions and threats are all about, to drive countries into a future New World Order. In other words, you aren't with us, you're against us, as George Bush would say, and we'll punish you. And, of course, the New World Order we build is anti-imperialistic, but in fact it is empire of a different sort, not a nationalism, not an American empire ultimately that is the goal. But, and this is my basic big picture view of the world that readers need to understand, is that all of this intervention is not done in the name of democracy. It's done in the name of creating more conflict, to create an image of the world, in the world, that the United States and NATO are the bullies of the world, so as to justify and help justify Russia and China when they finally take on the U.S. in a nuclear war, will justify their attack on the West as someone had to take down the bullies of the world. Friedman continues to claim, he says, my argument is that the latest version emerged of empire without planning or intention. The American president's unique status and influence are not derived from conquest, design, or divine ordination, but the result of the United States being the only global military power in the world, and that came about because of the collapse of the Soviet Union, the only other global power. Well, this, of course, is the supreme disinformation, that the Soviet Union collapsed and that the United States was just left holding this power in a vacuum. It was, the Soviet Union did not collapse out of the weight of economy or military or any other things that the propaganda puts out. It just went underground. The fact that everyone deep inside U.S. intelligence knows but isn't talking about, because they are prohibited by agency heads working for the powers that be, who are in turn setting us up for a Third World War. And we don't want people to know that we're building up the best enemies money can buy, as Dr. Stan Monteith says. Well, Friedman, if he were an honest analyst, would have easily discerned that the U.S. did much to manipulate its position into empire during both World War I and World War II, not to mention what happened at Bretton Woods, where the U.S. offered to use its gold supply to back the dollar and take advantage of England's massive debt to entice the world into making the dollar its world reserve currency. And it replaced the pound after that. This has directly led to U.S. economic dominance of the international economy, even after repudiating the gold standard, because the world had been suckered into accepting those dollars. And now it had no other choice but to keep spending them, even though they had no more worth in gold. Then Friedman makes the establishment case for wars being caused by competition for economic dominance. This is kind of a Marxist argument. He talks about Germany versus France and England and how that was destabilizing and caused World War I and World War II. But he says now, having one big hegemon, the U.S., in the world, is stabilizing. That the world is no longer filled, and I'm quoting from him, that the world is no longer filled with relative equal powers, easily tempted into military adventures, mitigates this war danger somewhat. Certainly, he continues, the dominance of American military power is such that no one country can hope to use main force to fundamentally redefine its relationship with the U.S. At the same time, however, we can see that the resistance to American power is substantial, and the wars have been frequent since 1991. So it's kind of contradicting itself. But in fact, that's my point. The resistance and resentment against the United States is because the world hates American bullying, not because of our liberty. In trying to demonstrate how the world has hope in U.S. promises for change, Friedman writes, quote, George Bush has been hated because he was seen as an imperialist bully. Obama is being celebrated because he signaled that he would not be an imperialist bully, hence the Nobel Peace Prize. My comment is this, too, was a fraud, and once again the world is losing faith that America will ever return to its peaceful roots. Obama has proved to be every much the imperialist and bully as George W. Bush. Now, this is interesting, Stan, because it means that George Friedman actually understands this concept of the American being hated and as a bully. And yet he's skewing it in favor of the fact that he doesn't even mention, the fact that the world has lost confidence in Obama as a change agent. Then he goes on, while American imperial might degrade, power of this magnitude does not collapse quickly except through war. So he also knows about the plans for war provocation, but isn't saying so. He says German, French, Japanese, and British power declined not so much of debt, but because of wars that devastated those countries' economies, producing debt, and I would say to the United States, as one of the war's many byproducts. Now, this proves my point that I've always made, that nations never collapse because of economic collapse, only by weakening themselves so that they become vulnerable to external attack. Except for the falsified fall of the Soviet Union, there's never any nation in the world that's ever collapsed by economic problems. Even Russia, at the lowest level of its Marxism, didn't collapse economically. In fact, most Russians, the older variety, want to go back to Russia where they had those guaranteed bread lines. At least they didn't have to work for a living. Then Friedman promotes the misinformation that debt doesn't matter. Listen to this. He says, the United States also may well be the largest borrower in the world, but that indebtedness does not reduce its ability to affect the international system. Well, that's only because the world is held hostage by how many dollars it holds. Debt and a defunct dollar threaten the U.S., but this is kept at bay only because other nations are as bad off or worse than the U.S. There's no other country that has a dollar or a currency that has anything worth more than the dollar. And whether the United States stops borrowing, he says, increases borrowing, or decreases, the American economy constantly shapes the global markets. Well, this is only true because the economy is all around the world living on the bloated dollars that the U.S. creates. If you would ask all the other countries if they want the U.S. to contract its money supply and have no money left over to buy their exports, they'd all say, no, inflate. And besides, governments like to inflate under the shadow of U.S. inflation because, you see, as long as their currency stays on par with the U.S., they can inflate under the hidden shadow of the U.S. inflation without it showing up as a detriment to their currency. Then he says, of course, it should be remembered that every dollar the U.S. borrows, others lend. Yes, but only because they have little choice in a world dominated by U.S. markets and the U.S. dollar. If they want to buy U.S. products, and if they want to buy oil, they need dollars. That's why they continue to use it. This doesn't mean that they're willingly wanting to lend dollars. It means that they have no choice and they want to get rid of dollars, and that's why they lend. If the market is to be trusted, he said, is the saying that lending to the United States, even at current low interest rates, is a good move. Well, my comment is it's only a good move relative to other bad choices.
But I think it's going to be so important for people to realize that things are changing. Certainly, it looks like the Japanese and Chinese began to cooperate to come up with some alternative means of exchange, using perhaps the yuan as the vehicle of exchange for Japan, certainly selling to China and China selling to Japan. And I fear that the average American doesn't understand the implications of what will happen if the dollar ceases to be the reserve currency of the world and the profound economic impact it's going to have on our way of life. But Mr. Friedman's trying to tell us everything's fine. Things are not fine. We're living on the edge of an abyss, and it's only a matter not of if, but when we plunge into that. Go right ahead.
Well, ultimately, Friedman posits the issue that hides the globalist real intent. He says, absent a major devastating war, any realignment of international influence based on economics will be a process that takes generations, if it happens at all. Now, that's precisely what he says. Why globalists push for more wars of intervention? It's because, short of a war, it would take generations to change the economic influence of the dollar.
And I think it's so vitally important people understand that the wars are planned. Why are they planned? They are planned to change the world. And we can go back and certainly hear the interview that we have with Norman Dodd, who's sent a researcher to go through the files of the Carnegie Institute for International Peace back in 1908, 1909. And there this Carnegie Endowment spent a whole year figuring out how best to change the world. They said war is the best way to change the world. And then 1909 to 1910 saying, how are we going to get America involved in a war? And 4 years later, we had World War I, a totally senseless and useless war to bring about the League of Nations. And when that failed, why we had to get World War II. And when World War II failed, why it only became a matter of time before the background for World War III would be created, and I believe we're in the process of creating that situation now. We'll be back in a moment with Joel Skousen. Wars do change the world, but I fear the next war will be dreadful. Go right ahead, Joe.
Well, let me give some background on Friedman that explains why he is fronting for and promoting the American empire. Friedman's the founder of Stratfor, a presumed private intelligence service which is actually a selective outlet for government intelligence intended to influence major corporations to go along with the interventionist agenda. In this, Friedman has been eminently successful. I was suspicious as soon as Stratfor came on the scene as a private intelligence agency. This startup company by a college professor, George Friedman, suddenly had huge amounts of economic and political analysis on every country of the world, updated weekly right from the start, but he was only charging a few $100s a year. As one in that business, like I am and you are, Dr. Stan, that's an impossible task for one man or even a dozen staffers. Having that many private sources in every country of the world, feeding that level of information, would have required salaries in the millions of dollars and taken decades to develop. The only other plausible explanation, he is being allowed to tap into government resources, CIA resources, and market them as private. Now, why would the government allow this? Because it was yet another way, in addition to CIA-controlled journalists publishing insider information, of putting out the globalist analysis of events and spinning it in a way that would keep American corporate leaders from suspecting the real ulterior motives for attacking other nations. No, it wasn't democracy or save people by humanitarian intervention. Friedman's analysis has always been interesting because of his insider knowledge on specifics, but the explanations of why things were happening always smacked of official disinformation. Talking at length about competing national interests and focusing on the establishment view of threats like the Muslim threat. The government never acts in people's national interest. That's merely the cover story. Western leaders are always creating and manipulating crises to further global integration by force, or allowing or just following orders of the Anglo-American powers who can threaten their political rank and position. A major anti-establishment hacking group broke into Stratfor's computers this week and found a treasure trove of government and corporate insider dealing. As Zero Heads commented, a collective of many hackers named Anonymous disclosed that not only has it hacked the Stratfor website, since confirmed by Friedman himself, but has also obtained the full client list of over 4,000 individuals and corporations. And since the leaked client list is a who's who of intelligence and capital management, including such names as Goldman Sachs, Rockefeller Foundation, MF Global, we are certain that not only Stratfor and the class will be waiting with bated breath to see just what additional troves of information are unleashed, but virtually everyone else in this sensitive time from a geopolitical point of view. Well, even more critical is that Anonymous has captured all the email traffic between Stratfor and these government insider corporations and banks. Now, this could become the new WikiLeaks of the century and expose how much manipulation of information goes on with what is fed to the American public and these insiders. Occasionally, we in the Liberty Movement get a break, and this may be one of those. However, I suspect the government will bring to bear all the power it possesses to stop these email leaks from seeing the light of day, or at least pressure them to censor the most revealing ones, as they did with WikiLeaks. Comments?
I think they've guessed that the last thing they want is for the American people to find the truth, and this is why I do what I do and why I know that Dwight Joel does what he's doing, and we'll be back here in just a moment here. Now, suddenly, Joel is just talking about the fact that somebody recently broke into the Stratfor files. Stratfor is supposedly this intelligent organization that's out there, already giving us the inside scoop about what's going on. Basically, of course, it's a government front, or let's call it the invisible government. The people who really run our government make mockery of the democratic process. But, of course, the funding for this whole thing comes from the very establishment, the Goldman Sachs, the big banks, the major corporations, which are part and parcel of our invisible government. And now the information's getting out that this and so many other so-called intelligence sources are really as phony as a $3 bill, and because the government government is furious. They didn't want WikiLeaks. Why? Because they don't want the American people to know the truth. Everything is in the national interest, and it's just to be protected for national security. No, ladies and gentlemen, they do not want the public to learn the truth, and now truth is coming out about Stratfor, and they're going to do the same thing with them. They're going to crush the people if they can find it who are leaking the truth. They can never let the American people understand that we sent our boys halfway around the world to fight and bleed and suffer and die in intentional no-win wars, great diversions, but the ultimate goal, a one-world government, a one-world financial system, a one-world religion with the destruction of Christianity, and imposing upon the world a one-world leader. Go right ahead, Joel.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the various hotspots around the world. Let me begin with a summary of what's going on with Iran. The Iranian regime thus far has failed to retaliate for the numerous provocations unleashed by Israel and the U.S. Several Iranian scientists have been murdered. 2 explosions have gone off at Iran's nuclear enrichment sites. U.S.-sponsored terrorists have made multiple incursions into Iran, and U.S. has violated Iran's airspace with numerous surveillance drones, one of which was recently captured intact by Iran. The U.S. is desperately trying to elicit a violent Iranian response that will justify their long-planned attack on the number 3 oil producer in the world.
But don't forget, of course, we gave something, this was probably several years ago, to an organization called MEK, M-E-K, a terrorist organization cited by our own government as terrorists, and we're funding them to go in and simply disrupt Iran, to simply disrupt their government and kill people and assassinate their leaders. That's an act of war. We place sanctions on Iran, their exports, and certainly their exchange of dollars. That is an act of war. We are at war with Iran. We've been at war with Iran for several years, and nobody wants to say it.
Well, 2 years ago, the U.S. deliberately tried to provoke the U.S. fleet into attacking Iranian speedboats that were circling them from afar in the Straits of Hormuz, using Iranian-speaking provocateurs broadcasting phony attack instructions. Fortunately, the U.S. commander didn't take the bait. And now the stakes are much higher, of course. Iran has set itself up, I'm afraid, though, by claiming that they will shut down the Straits of Hormuz if more sanctions go into effect. At the same time, they're holding major naval exercises in the Straits in order to make good on that threat. Now, this is just what the U.S. wants and has moved an aircraft carrier group into the Strait, which invites a major war should any trick-or-happy Iranian speedboat captain make a mistake and attack this. Fortunately, our naval commanders are straight-up guys, and they're not about, just like the naval commander 2 years ago didn't take the bait and didn't attack the Iranian speedboats. I don't think you can, snooker the Americans into doing something stupid. They'll have to work on the Iranians to do that.
We're moving actually 3 carrier groups into the Gulf. I mean, the Vincent, the Abraham Lincoln, the Stettinius, and then we've got another one out there in the Mediterranean. That's 4 carrier groups in the area. That is the most intense concentration of military power. They're going to be there for a purpose. They did this one time about 3 or 4 years ago when I thought maybe they're going to try to get a war at that time, but somebody obviously told George Bush he couldn't have the war at that time and he had to back down. But we're doing the same thing. 3 carrier groups in the Gulf now. It could be one of them might be there, certainly to replace the Stettinius. I don't know. Gonna have to wait and see. But go ahead, Joel.
That's right. If they don't replace the Stennis and the Stennis stays on station, then we'll know that they're staying there for a planned attack. That stand down that you talked about was in 2007 when the U.S. decided that this would accrue if they attacked Iran to Ron Paul, who was running in 2008 for president as an anti-war candidate, and I think that's why they pulled it. They've got a real problem this time because Ron Paul's still running, and that's why I think they're going to postpone the attack on Iran until the fall.
All right. Well, hang on. We'll be back here in just a moment with Joel Skousen. And World Affairs Brief, you'll certainly want to get it. We'll be back in just a moment here as we go over Joel's analysis of what happened this last year. Joel, you go right ahead.
Well, that's an important concept about, holding off so this attack doesn't accrue to the favor of Ron Paul as a major candidate who is anti-war, the only Republican candidate who is not in the neocons' pocket. And the establishment has a real problem with Ron Paul now that he's probably going to win at least the Ohio caucus, and he may well win New Hampshire as well. And they're very well prepared to explain why Iowa is irrelevant, but they'd have a tough time explaining away New Hampshire as well. Ron Paul's polling numbers in New Hampshire are almost 19%, which is double what they are nationwide. So he's got a real good chance in New Hampshire. I think the attacks, of course, that have gone forth on Ron Paul this week have largely fallen on deaf ears. The Republicans who are in favor of Ron Paul really can't be moved off that course. They're, of course, trying to get those that aren't decided yet to moving over to Ron Paul as Gingrich goes down further and further in the polls. Now, their choices, of course, from this point on, if Ron Paul starts to win, I mean, they have this anybody but Romney thing going on, and if Ron Paul wins two primaries, they're going to have to resurrect someone like Santorum if they can't pull this off with Gingrich. Gingrich has always been their preferred candidate from the beginning. He's a true globalist. He's a full insider. He's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Rick Santorum may not be a wolf in sheep's clothing, but he certainly is a full neocon. He's one of the worst at proclaiming that we've got to go to war against Iran. My prediction for the new year, the election year, is that if Romney gets the nomination, of which he may well do because of the default of all the other candidates and their attempts to discredit Paul, and they will do everything they can to stop Paul from getting the nomination. But if Romney gets the nomination, I'm predicting that they will pull off this war in Iran sufficiently close to the election in order to re-elect Obama, because the American people hardly ever dump an American president in the middle, or especially in the initial stages of a war.
Well, it's going to be interesting to see what happens. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and of course, I guess it's Joel Skousen, and Joel is saying that certainly the establishment doesn't want Romney as the candidate if he should get the Republican nomination. Joel thinks that, of course, that they will then hold the war off until we get down close to the election in November of next year, and then, of course, they'll have the war so that people will vote for Obama. They certainly don't want certainly Romney as the candidate. They would love to have Newt Gingrich or Perry, one of their own people. I mean, Newt Gingrich is a member of the CFR. Perry's been to Bilderberg meetings. But the last thing they want is for Ron Paul. And what's so exciting is the fact that so many young people are listening to him. People, despite all the attacks of saying what a terrible leftist he is, why he's even to the left of Obama. I mean, and of course his isolationist policies and his crazy support for the Constitution certainly disqualify him. He's so rigid, and why he always says the same thing over and over again. He just won't shift his positions, which, of course, as far as I'm concerned, is why I think he's a great candidate. But be that as it may, before we go on, Joel, I want you to tell our listeners how they can get a copy of the World Affairs Brief, how they can get your books on strategic relocation, setting the secure home, and how to build a secure room in your home. Ladies and gentlemen, we're moving into a period of chaos and crisis. We're going to see increasing civil unrest in this country. You're going to see the breakdown of the very structure of many of our governmental facilities. It's not a matter of if but when. It is all being planned by what I call the Brotherhood of Darkness. Joel, how can people get copies of your publication, World Affairs Brief?
Well, the World Affairs Brief has a modest subscription, $48 a year. People can get a free sample if they'd like before they subscribe. They can email me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. On my other site, joelskousen.com, that's Skousen, did view a rundown of the various books that Stan was talking about. My top seller is Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. It's in its third edition, all new color maps and charts so that you can help dissect the information about each state and region of the Americas and Canada. Lots of contingency planning on how to help people if they cannot move, need to establish a retreat or a plan to be able to get out of major cities in a crisis. My major work is the 700-page Secure Home book, and that's everything from A to Z on remodeling and new design and construction for high-security residences and retreats. Last book is How to Implement a High-Security Shelter in the Home, the smaller plan book of how to do a safe room in an existing basement. And all of these books can be had from Radio Liberty.
By calling 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927, and Joel's books are among our very best sellers. But go right ahead. You were talking something about the situation there in the Near East. You thought that they were going to hold the war off perhaps until just before the election. But go ahead.
Well, we were talking a little bit about the implications of Ron Paul on the war plans. He has always factored into those plans because the United States government knows that there's a real anti-war sentiment in the United States, what they call isolationism, to give it a negative slant. But it's much like what was happening with Bob Taft when he was running for president against Eisenhower, and certainly Ron Paul's probably the best candidate we've ever had in this country. Most principled and most close to the Constitution. So this is the time of a lifetime to really put out our effort to support Ron Paul and make sure we have return to constitutional principles. We have an advantage in that the establishment Republicans have changed, gotten most states in the Republican Party to change so that there is a proportional representation system for delegates in primary elections, meaning that it's not a winner-take-all system like it was in 2008, so that if you got 49%, you got none of the delegates. Now the delegates in most states, Florida is not one of those, unfortunately, so that's why it's a very important primary. It will take, the one who wins Florida will take all the delegates. But in other states, Ron Paul, who has a majority, will take the percentage of delegates that he gets, and he'll end up with a big fat chunk at the Republican convention and will certainly be a force to be reckoned with. If you remember in 2008, they really were so afraid of Ron Paul's support and the fact that there was dissatisfaction with the winner-take-all system that it excluded a lot of Ron Paul wins, including Nevada, where he won the delegates, and then they shut down the convention so that none of the Ron Paul delegates could actually get certified. Now it's going to be a whole different ballgame. Ron Paul is going to be a major player in the convention. They'll attempt to slight him in some way, denying him a chance to speak during prime time, anything they can to keep this man's influence down. But I'm convinced that it's still going to be a great opportunity to build the movement, and we really don't have the majority, I'm afraid to say, but we certainly have the largest minority that we have ever had, and mostly due to the candidacy of Ron Paul. And so if we want to build the movement, we must not engage in the pessimism that he can't win, because every person that we convert to the constitutional free market agenda of Ron Paul, the greater we'll be able to resist the ongoing slide of tyranny that I'm describing in the World Affairs Brief.
Agreed. Basically, ladies and gentlemen, there are people who want a dictatorship in America. There's a small cabal of very wealthy people who believe that some men are born to rule, and most men are born to be ruled. That's what David Rockefeller told a friend of mine who told me, that was Congressman Tannemeyer. Well, some men are born to rule, most people are born to be ruled. What they want is a fascist society in America, headed by these people of great wealth and great intelligence who know what's best for us. And one of the best things for us is simply to transfer our jobs overseas, to lower our living standards, and it's all part of their plan. And if you doubt it, get David Rockefeller's memoirs, page 405, and read his memoirs and find out also what good friends his daughters are, Fidel Castro, and why do David's daughters go down to visit Fidel, and why does Fidel come up to visit David? I suspect they sit around and laugh at how stupid the American people are to really believe there's a communist threat. Oh, sure, 58,000 American boys died in Vietnam, and hundreds of thousands of still bear the pain of their wounds. But remember, we were funding the Russians who funded the North Vietnamese, who funded the Viet Cong, all during the war. We could have won in 6 weeks. We weren't allowed to win. We could have won the war in Afghanistan many years ago. We didn't do it. We had won the war in Iraq after 6 days, and they dragged our troops out from 2003 into 2011. When we finally pulled all the troops out, well, of course, we did leave 15,000 personnel in the embassy, and we left a lot of trainers over there, military personnel for training, and we've got our troops in Kuwait, and we've got our troops in Afghanistan, the troops that should have come home after Iraq, but we're keeping them in that area for when the next war comes. But go ahead.
Let's continue our rundown of problem nations here. North Korea, after the death of Kim Jong-il this past week or so, North Korea control has fully passed to the military despite crowning Kim's young son, Kim Jong-un, as the supreme leader. No credible analyst believes that the young Kim, is running the country, but he will be useful in presenting a more peaceful face to the North Koreans and inducing the West to enter into yet another nuclear freeze or exchange in exchange for more aid. Of course, North Korea has always backed out of those and failed to comply with their nuclear freeze proposition. Despite blustering by South Korea in the recent discovery of 69 Patriot missiles, which were disguised as fireworks heading to China, there is no imminent threat of war. My prediction still holds that North Korea is reserved as a trigger event for World War III and that it won't happen until China and Russia are fully ready to retaliate. It's a perfect setup for nuclear war since North Korea military forces are so superior in numbers and equipment, especially artillery, to South Korea, that the only way the U.S. could stop a quick invasion of South Korea is to launch tactical nuclear weapons. And that will excuse the Chinese and Russians of launching their long-planned nuclear attack on America. Well, switching to Taiwan, the U.S. continues to play lip service to defending Taiwan, but never allowing its advanced weapons to deter future Chinese attack. Advanced F-16 fighters from Free China have once again been rejected by the Obama administration. China throws a fit, of course, every time the U.S. increases arms shipments to Taiwan. However, I suspect that the disguised 69 Patriot missiles discovered on a German ship in Finland headed to Shanghai, China, were not destined for China or South Korea. Only a fool would pretend to be shipping fireworks to China when they are all made there. There has also been no reason to disguise the missiles as fireworks going to South Korea because she already has Patriot batteries, and it's no secret that the U.S. has to hide. I suspect that the missiles were secretly going to be dropped off in Taiwan as a part of a secret deal to compensate Taiwan for not receiving offensive weapons. Now moving to Israel. Israel is gearing up for an attack on Iran and simultaneously having to deal with the coming third intifada. Intifada means uprising in Palestinian and Arabic. That's referring to the Palestinians in Gaza. When Israel attacks Iran, and I don't say if, I say when it attacks, they expect to suffer thousands of casualties from the thousands of non-guided missiles aimed at them from Lebanon and Syria, plus an attack from guided missiles from Iran. As Jason Ditz points out of antiwar.com, a report today is claiming that the Obama administration is in secret talks with the Israeli government to figure out exactly what would constitute a good excuse for launching an attack on Iran. Now, this is the thing they've been looking for years, is trying to have an excuse to launch on. As I said in the Iran section, Iran hasn't given them an excuse yet. Behind the scenes, the administration has been seeking to clarify what exactly counts as red lines that would give the U.S. and Israel the excuse to launch an attack. Officially, of course, both sides would insist such an attack was all about Iran's nuclear program. But since both nations have been claiming Iran is within striking distance of acquiring nuclear weapons since the mid-1980s, the excuse isn't going to really fly internationally. So both nations are hoping to settle on something that would trigger the attack. And Tom Burkhardt discusses those red lines And really, they are all about the nuclear weapons. And Liam Panetta and various other pundits on the evening news are saying that Iran will have a weapon within the year. There's virtually no intelligence to cooperate that, none whatsoever. And yet, Panetta says, having a nuclear weapon or getting close to one is a red line for us. You know, you can always justify they're close to one. You don't have to have any proof. If we do it, he says, if they get a weapon or have a weapon, we will have to deal with it. All military options are on the table, and we will take whatever necessary steps to stop it. That's the position of Romney, Gingrich, Santorum, Michelle Bachmann, everyone but Ron Paul. Well, moving on to Syria, unless the Iranian war games in the Straits of Hormuz produce an incident that justifies an Israeli attack on Iran, Syria will be taken down by U.S. NATO intervention before the Iranian attack.
And I think it's very important for people to understand we have our special forces over there in Jordan training the anti-Syrian rebels. We have our special forces over in Turkey training the anti-Syrian rebels. Basically, this is an American war because our American soldiers aren't necessarily involved, but American forces are arming and training the anti-Syrian rebels. And the American people have never asked, what right do we have over there to go over there and topple all these governments? We've already toppled Libya. We've toppled Tunisia. We've toppled Egypt. We're in the process of toppling Syria. And where is the outcry from our congressional leaders saying, we haven't declared war over there. Why are we over there involved in all of these military operations? But it's all part of the move towards the world empire, and of course now building up the Muslim Brotherhood, which will take over in all of these countries, and somewhere down the line I think there's going to be some sort of a conflict. What do you think about that?
Yes, I agree that there is going to be a conflict. I don't think that the war in Iran or with Syria is going to turn into a third world war. But as I say, the members of the Obama administration are confirming that the National Security Council has been instructed to begin seeking options for U.S. intervention in Syria. This is unlikely that the current sanctions are working. The focus is always on, quote, aid to Syrian opposition. But unspoken in all of this, of course, is exactly what segments of the Syrian opposition are being aided. The ones that are already armed and in violent confrontation with Syrian armed forces are the ones that the U.S. is working with. They're also considering a no-fly zone. They're considering a safe zone inside Syrian territory to establish through military means a Turkish enclave on the border, which will then slowly expand as they did into Libya, conquer territory that belongs to the opposition. And they will use, but of course, to develop that safe zone, especially since the Syrian regime is not a pushover militarily, they would have to use NATO airstrikes as they did in Libya to make that into a no-fly zone. And if covert aid to the opposition doesn't work fast enough, which I doubt it will, we'll see a renewed effort to focus on the one-sided number of unarmed civilians, quote, deaths to justify a full-scale intervention. It's really interesting how the media never talks, and they talk about 200 people killed in conflicts with the Syrian police and military forces. They never talk about the fact that the civilians killed, a lot of them were armed, and that's why there is violent confrontation. We're moving on to China. China will continue to play the strategy of pushing around the little guys in the China Sea as she demands more territorial mineral rights. But she won't tangle with the U.S. until she's ready. All the talk about not letting the U.S. attack Iran is just a bluff. China, as one of Iran's major oil and gas clients, will become an aggrieved party to the war and will use U.S. predation to add to her list of complaints that will someday be used to justify war with the West. In the meantime, China's economy is shrinking significantly compared to the boom years. The factories still producing exports are doing fine, even though experiencing a slowdown. But the half-built factories, condos, apartments, the worker cities have collapsed and lay vacant. The loans that built them have defaulted. The Bank of China has some massive losses. Yes, China still has the huge stockpile of foreign exchange reserves, mostly in dollars and euros. But those are increasingly a burden as China is anxious to unload about half of those reserves, but it can't do so without incurring huge losses as the euro and the dollar sink in value.
Well, certainly there's a great deal of uncertainty in the world. Certainly the economies are shrinking all throughout the world. Certainly China, Europe, Japan, here in the United States and England, and certainly even though South America has done fairly well in the past, they're still having to begin to have some problems there as well. We're in for some very difficult financial times in the months and years that lie ahead. Well, Joel, you've got 3 minutes to wrap up the program.
Thanks, Dan. China will continue her policy of not doing anything rash in the monetary realm except continue to inflate the renminbi, her currency, and spend dollars and euros for commodities and Western companies that produce real assets, as she has been doing in Australia. China's bought up a good portion of the companies in Australia and the mineral rights, and is harvesting those for review, and that almost guarantees that in the next war, I think that Australia will get invaded and occupied. New Zealand as well. That's why I'm not encouraging Americans in my book, Strategic Relocation, to relocate down there. Much of the globalist agenda is aimed at squeezing China for oil and other natural resources she doesn't produce, the same strategy used prior to Pearl Harbor to force the Japanese to attack. It has a long fuse, however, given that compared to the Roosevelt strategy in cutting off Japanese oil. The cutoff of Japanese oil and iron ore was nearly complete, whereas China has other resources and does not yet have to resort to war to circumvent the U.S. intervention. Don't take too much stock in the launching of China's first aircraft carrier, remodeled from a surplus carrier out of the Ukraine. It has limited weapon systems and is to be used mostly for training. However, China's submarine fleet is getting increasingly sophisticated and quiet and has slipped into U.S. naval fleet formations undetected on 2 occasions and even launched a ballistic missile just off the coast of Los Angeles, which the U.S. Pentagon covered up. But China needs at least 10 years to complete plans for 4 aircraft carriers and a much larger blue water navy to escort those carriers and to ferry troops for invasion. So I'm not predicting in my timeline that this Third World War will come anything short of 8 to 10 years, and it could be longer, depending on how much China and Russia suspect that the U.S. has hidden weapons that they can't compete with, and that's what's kept them at bay for many years. So my word is that we have more time to prepare, Stan. That's good news. We should not use that as a means of complacency, but we do have time to do things without panic and to prepare with providential thinking.
Well, thank you so very much. Of course, our guest has been Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief, and certainly you can go to worldaffairsbrief.com and get his material. God bless you, Joel. Thank you so much, and we'll look forward to having you with us again next week at the same time.
Thank you, and have a great Happy New Year.
And you as well. Bye-bye. Okay, well, ladies and gentlemen, of course, that was Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief, and you go to his website. He has the update on events, and certainly every Thursday and Friday he comes out with his predictions for what the future holds. Well, this is Dr. Stan. We do hope you enjoy our regular interviews with Joel Skousen. He's got some very, very clear views, and certainly no one knows exactly what the future holds, but I think you should give serious consideration to Joel's views. I do believe there's going to be a major war coming up in the Near East and the Middle East, and I base part of what I believe certainly on the prophetic stories that we find in the Bible. And if you go back and you read, of course, Isaiah 17, if you read Psalms 83, and then, of course, Ezekiel 38 and 39, you can fairly well tell who the combatants are going to be. Because remember, God knew long before all these things came about what was going to happen. We have some excellent books, certainly, on this subject. We have, of course, Lynn Marzulli's excellent books, Prophecy, Politics, Prophecy, and the Supernatural. His DVDs on Watchers 1, Watchers 2, and now Watchers 3. His little book on alien interviews. It is not interviews with aliens, it's simply interviews with people who claim they've been abducted by aliens. Of course, you'll see his interviews with Dr. Lair, who's actually removed 60 of the implants that were put into these people after they had been abducted by the so-called aliens. I believe they're cursed demonic beings, as does Lynn Marzulli. You need to get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. You need to hear my talk on the dark secret, on the forbidden secret, and get the syllabuses to go with that. You need to get our 4 CD set on the satanic crimes and the book that goes along with that, and we are 4 CD set on the supernatural. And Joanna Michelson's book goes along with that, The Beautiful Side of Evil. Because you see, behind everything going on are powerful spiritual forces. So much of what's going on really doesn't make sense. Why are we, for instance, opening up all of our military, these secret military facilities to the Chinese communist scientists and allowing them to come over here and examine all of our military secrets? Whereas, of course, we will not allow the American people to know that. Everything is classified, and yet we bring in the Chinese communist scientists to go over our most well-kept secrets. It doesn't matter unless you understand that everything is fraudulent. You need to get my book, Brotherhood of Darkness. You need to read it. You need to study it. You need to think about it and contemplate it. We have so much great material. Go to our website, radioliberty.com, and you can suddenly find the books we offer and the videos and DVDs and the tape sets and the CD sets. Get the information, read it, but understand the common denominator. We are involved in a spiritual battle for the souls of men and the survival of Christian civilization. If you're in a position to help Radio Liberty, we'd love to hear from you. Our number is 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927. If you're not in a position to help us, and I understand that many people out there are really hurting financially, why we ask you to pray for Radio Liberty, for our provision and for our protection. We ask you, of course, to pray for certainly Alex Jones. He's doing a great job getting information out that you'll never hear elsewhere. Joyce Riley, John Leffler, many of the people we have on our programs are risking their lives to come on and tell the truth. And then, of course, we ask you to pray for Ron Paul, because he is risking his life. He's doing what he's doing not because he wants to be president. He's 76 years old. He's lived a full life, but because he realizes we need someone to rally behind who will remind us about our Constitution, about the foundations of our freedom, which, of course, really are founded in a document I believe is divinely inspired. And if you haven't certainly read the documents that Chuck Baldwin put together dealing with America's founding documents are available from Radio Liberty. Again, our number 1-800-544-8927, 1-800-544-8927. Please pray for Radio Liberty, our provision and our protection.